Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho. Joining me on set is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kabbalah Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you?
Well, not only am I hugely terrific, but I remain simple, easy, and you know what? Awesome.
I like your jacket. It's one of those colors that is really good.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I like your style too.
Well, I'm looking up to you, man. Yeah. Yeah. A warm welcome to all our Facebook followers are watching us live. Shaka Extra Time is a show that comes to you every Tuesday, and today we'll be talking about a wide range of issues. But let's start in South Sudan. We are at it again, Shaka. The government of national unity, as we speak today, the government of national unity in South Sudan was supposed to be in place. What happened?
It was supposed to be in place, and as you know, of course, this is the second time that it is actually being postponed, because the last time I checked, the government was supposed to be in place in May. It never happened. They said, okay, let's move the goalposts and make sure that it is in place in November. It hasn't happened. They also decided to again move the political goalposts. Now they are talking about 100 days, Paul, from today.
What was the significance of them going to Uganda, considering the fact that Uganda, under the leadership of President Yoweri Museveni, it hasn't played a neutral role?
Yeah, but whether you like it or not, Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni is a very key player in that particular region. This is a man, first of all, who has been in power for a very, very long time, Paul, the last time I checked. He came to power, remember, in 1986. And even though at one time he said that he was so contemptuous of those African leaders who sit tight, the Nigerians say, who stay longer in power, lately he's been saying that, in fact, it is an advantage to stay in power for very long, because guess what? He says he has the experience. And therefore, probably, he has the experience either in good governance or bad governance, whatever you want to actually to call it. But obviously, you know, they say that the proof is in eating the beans.
Interesting. Are you perhaps suggesting that the two leaders are looking for ways maybe to stay a little bit longer? I mean, we've been talking about these peace talks. Some people have referred to them as peace jokes. Here we are today, they're talking of another extension. How many more times can they extend this at the expense of ordinary South Sudanese?
You know, it looks like when you actually put Southern Sudan under a sort of microscope, you would probably find some of those individual leaders really, people that reflect what someone would call social, political, economic insensitivity. Because as you rightly said, the vast majority of that country called the Republic of South Sudan are actually doing the suffering. They're doing the suffering, and the leaders have at least some kind of privileges, some window of, being able to have at least a guarantee of 3 meals a day, and those people that are supposed to be very close to them and what have you. But the ordinary Sudanese does not. I mean, the ordinary Southern Sudanese. And you know, even with the power of the Pope Francis, you recall that earlier this year, he hosted them at the Vatican. And you remember that the Vatican should be symbolically very, very significant, but guess what? It is one of those few remnants of what was once the mighty Roman Empire. And when it comes to the spiritual clout, the spiritual power, you cannot compare the Pope with any other leader, really, that heads almost any institution. This man invited these two individuals. They had very interesting talks in April, and they were supposed, in fact, to put in place a government of national unity the following month. This man actually knelt down on their feet, almost kissed their feet, and urged them to make sure that they form a government of national unity so that they could restore a semblance of peace and stability, so that people in turn can actually stop the suffering that they were doing. It never happened. And now he's actually saying again that he is finally going to pay a visit to the Republic of South Sudan. This is a visit, by the way, which was supposed to be conducted back in 2017.
Right.
But because of lack of security and all that kind of stuff, he couldn't do it.
Let's do two quicker follow-ups. Let's go to Dev Duff.
But before you go there, Paul, I would like frankly to say that these two individuals, if they are listening to us, it is time, sincerely, for them to go beyond simply the modalities, the symbolisms of appending their signatures on pieces of paper. Because we know, obviously, that what has come out of all these peace talks they have held, all these agreements they have held, it has almost virtually come to what someone used to say is like looking at a couple planning a marriage while concentrating on divorce. I honestly think we should now go beyond that, and these guys should be able to walk the talk so that their people should sincerely begin to wear some smiles on their face and walk the walk.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. Let's go to Steve Duff. What's wrong with these two leaders of South Sudan? And another quicker follow-up from James Rao Majak. As the world is looking at a South Sudanese peace agreement, what is the way forward for implementation of peace in South Sudan?
I think it is not simply an issue of two individuals, really. I think that you also have to look at these individuals in the context of those people who follow them, their supporters, because they must be doing something that somehow is a reflection of the interest of the people who follow them or support them. But I think that what we are looking at in South Sudan is not limited to South Sudan, because we are actually talking about issues of social, cultural, economic, political injustice here. What is needed is justice. And the only way you can bring it about is through accountability. When you look at South Sudan, and you look at many other African governments on the continent, part of the problem is that these are not, for example, democracies. These are governments that do not really account to their people in as far as the decisions they make are concerned.
Let's do another quicker follow-up. Let's stay in South Sudan. Let's go to Mayen Dingit. We in South Sudan no longer trust these two devils. No amount of prayers can change the nature of Satan. And another quicker follow-up from Abigaba Habib Bashir. I don't know what South Sudan need to do because they're not valuing their peace agreements, I guess, in light of what you just talked about.
Yeah, and I think that part of the reason, because obviously if you are in a position where you don't need necessarily to account your action to somebody or some people, then you probably don't have the motivation nor the incentive in fact, to be able to do it. I think that the IGAD really, the regional grouping that is supposed to be behind these deals that are being signed and yet not implemented really, I think they need to come up with another way of looking at this situation. They need to hit some of these leaders in their checkbook. In fact, we need first and foremost to look for the fundamental root causes of why we are where we are. Surely these causes must be known. We know, for example, that there is the issue, for example, of the 32 states that were unilaterally put in place by President Salva Kiir Mayardit, because the SPLA-IO was essentially saying, why don't you let the 10 states remain 10 states? And in fact, if you want to even increase the states, perhaps you should in fact move to the deal that was made in January 1956 when the Sudan regained its political independence. And at that time, of course, South Sudan was part of that Sudan, which happened to have the distinction of being the single largest country, at least in terms of land, on the continent at that time. At that time, there were 21 regions, which you could call states. This is what the SPLA-IO has been saying. They say that they don't understand how Salva Kiir Mayardit unilaterally decided to move the states from 10 to 32. And then there is the issue, the all-important issue of security. Right. You're talking about these different groups having different armies, but the deal calls for a national army. Why can't it be done? These are the things that IGAD leaders really, and indeed the African Union, and the international community, especially the United Nations Security Council, which has the mandate of making sure that the world is peaceful, to make sure that these things are done. If they're not done, there must be a price, a negative price to pay.
Yeah. Before we go to another topic, how about those who argue that maybe both leaders need to be out of the picture? There are those critics who also argue that maybe we need a sort of a radical leader like the former president of Ghana, who came and cleared the whole, some of the leaders who are just disturbing peace, being corrupt. He cleared them out, and the place has been a little bit reasonably stable compared to most places.
You know, it is very interesting that you talk about the former Ghanaian president, Flight Lieutenant Jerry John Rawlings, retired, but of course, as you know, not tired. People forget that when he took over Ghana for the first time, I believe it was in '79, he was actually sitting in prison. He had tried to essentially overthrow the government at the time, and the coup failed. He and his colleagues were arrested, and they were detained. It wasn't until other colleagues of his, not from the Air Force, because Flight Lieutenant Jerry John Rawlings was from the Ghanaian Air Force.
Right.
It was people from the army led by a Captain Bwachi Jan. And Captain Bwachi Jan, I guess, they became a major later. This is the man with many non-commissioned officers who eventually overthrew a general who had also earlier overthrown another senior military officer, Colonel Achempong.
Yeah,
and
let's
then
move on,
they
Shaka.
identified the things that must be done. And then they went ahead and released Flight Lieutenant Jerry John Rawlings. And when they released him, he became the symbol of that successful military coup. And he was given certain conditions to, in a sense, to be done. So he actually was able to fulfill what had earlier been identified by the leaders who had actually just completed a successful military coup. So it was not really his idea.
Okay, let's move on. The Germans are celebrating 30 years of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, said something that I found to be so profound. He said, there is no wall that is so high, so wide, that it can't be overcome. What was she trying to, like, maybe throw stones at the US President Donald Trump?
I think that it is very interesting that she said that, and there are a lot of people who perhaps don't know or don't even remember that great lady, Angela Merkel, actually happened to come from what used to be eastern part of Germany. The one that in fact was very, very largely affected by the war. That's where she came from. That war symbolized obviously the Cold War. The world became bipolar. It was in essence divided between two superpowers. That war was put in place by those who obviously took their orders from Moscow. Moscow, which at the time happened to be the capital of what was the then Soviet Union, which collapses later in 1991 when it is under, is it Mikhail Gorbachev?
Yeah.
Gorbachev came with perestroika and glasnost. And eventually it helped to liberate Germany. You remember there was a president in the White House at the time of the United States by the name Ronald Reagan.
Yeah,
and you probably remember Gorbachev tear that wall.
Right.
So it really took two to tango in a sense. But you know, it also helped the African countries, because for the first time, the African countries got the opportunity to restore what was called multi-party politics. Because until that time, most of the African countries, if not all, were basically practicing what is called the one-party state, which obviously was a social, economic, political template borrowed from the Soviet Union.
But Shaka, with the exception of a few countries, going back to the point that you just made, with the exception of a few countries, where has that worked? I see all these places where opposition is trying to rise up and they're being battered like snakes, or, you know, or being battered like chicken thieves all over the countries.
Actually, you are right in a sense, Paul, that the people who have led, for example, most countries on the African continent, which used to be under one-party state, they basically agreed, at least in theory, and it is true that a lot of countries on the African continent, which sometimes we refer to as nascent democracies, like Tanzania, for example, a lot of countries, yes, they practice multi-party politics on paper, but in reality, that multi-party politics is essentially conducted on in a manner that reflects the one-party state template.
Interesting.
Because in fact, when you look at a country like, again, like Tanzania, you look at a country like Uganda,
Which is a multi-party state.
Yes.
But
you look at a country like Burundi, you look at a country like Rwanda, and I can go on and go on and go on. You will find, in fact, that there is no separation of the ruling party from the state or the government. The government and the party, in a sense, are one and the same. They are fused. And therefore, when you have an election, for example, it is the incumbent, the person who heads the government in power, that decides how the game is going to be played. It's like imagining that you are having a football match, and obviously you are having two players, or two teams for that matter. But one of the teams is, for example, headed by somebody who has the power to choose the referees, perhaps to choose even the type and kind of ball that you need to play, and perhaps to choose the linesmen, and probably to even, in fact, choose the spectators. That's really what happens for the most part. So you have a situation sincerely where you have like two people, to make it very, very, very simple. Like you and I are seated here, and we are supposed to be competing in terms of boxing. And because I am in power,
you
Paul,
punch me and my hands are tied.
I make sure that your hands are tied behind your backs and your feet are tied together. And I punch you because for me, I'm very free, and say, why don't you punch back?
In Uganda, they call it kandoya.
Kandoya.
Yes.
Yeah, that probably may have come even out of the struggle against apartheid.
Interesting. Somebody just sent out a comment. Let's go to Katushabe Kenneth. We were talking about at the end of the Cold War. What do you think can be done to improve the situation in East Africa? It seems like there is a Cold War between, for instance, Uganda and Rwanda and Burundi. Great point.
It is very interesting, but again, you see, it is the issues of socio-economic political injustice. It is again the issues of having countries which are not really led by leaders. If they are leaders, they are the type of leaders who impose themselves upon their people.
No.
Because they do not account to their people for the decisions they actually make.
Shaka.
So these are, in fact, one could very, I think, legitimately refer to them as rulers.
Shaka, I have to push back on that. When you say these are not leaders, what are you implying? Are you suggesting that these are people who just came from Mars and just planted themselves there? Or these are legitimate leaders who have been elected by those people in those countries?
First of all, Paul, you know as well as I do that some of these leaders have a very interesting history. Initially, they did not come to power because people had in fact voted for them. They came to power because they had essentially become disgusted with the social, economic, political situation in their countries. They mobilized and organized themselves along the AK-47. And they used the AK-47 to say that they were in fact fighting for you and me. They were trying to liberate you and me. That is why they took on the government. And it is true that to a certain degree, there are ordinary people who supported these people, because if they did not support these people, there is no way they could have probably succeeded. But once they succeeded in seizing power, they therefore believed sincerely, and you can even see it reflected in some of their actions, that they were in fact entitled to power. They were entitled to doing whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted to do it. They did not have to consult. They do not consult. If they consulted, their people would not have allowed, for example, the border between Rwanda and Uganda to be closed. I mean, you interact with, with citizens of Rwanda almost on a daily basis right here in Washington. You talk to people in Rwanda, you talk to people in Uganda and what have you. People do not have problems interacting with one another, trading with one another. It is simply these two individuals at the head of these respective governments that have a problem of what some psychologists would probably regard as an ego. It's an ego thing. And the reason they are able to actually survive, or at least seem to be succeeding doing that, again, is because they do not have the option of accountability.
Let's go to Zimbabwe. Let's go to Evangelist Kwasi Bwake. Who is to blame for Zimbabwe's economic crisis and the sanctions and the mismanagement of the economy, especially in light of the fact that today the government of Zimbabwe announced that they're releasing a new currency, Zimbabwe dollars. The last time you and I were there, I actually picked up a couple $1 billion on paper. I'm a very wealthy guy.
You were actually a millionaire.
Yeah, I'm a billionaire.
Very proud of you.
Yeah, I'm not just a millionaire, but a billionaire on paper.
Yes.
But in reality, that money really is worthless.
It is true, and in fact, as you can see, the people do not seem to have confidence in the newly introduced Zimbabwean dollars, because again, they don't have confidence in it because they think and they probably know that it is almost worthless. I think, again, for Zimbabwe to have a respectable currency, for Zimbabwe to shine again as it used to do for many, many years, it needs to figure out a way of making sure that it gets their politics right.
But I thought getting rid of Mugabe was the ultimate answer to what you just said.
No, but it was not only Mugabe. First of all, you have to understand that you do not have what you would call really a political playing field that is leveled when it comes to all the primary stakeholders in Zimbabwe. I think sincerely, what I think is needed there, I am not an expert to the extent that perhaps I am the only person who knows what is right and what is wrong. But from my experience, from the people I have talked with, and from some observers of Zimbabwe and sympathizers and empathizers and what have you, it seems to me that you need to do something that can help to bring all the people on the table. You need, for example, to create a government again of national unity in Zimbabwe. In other words, a government that will also involve members of the opposition, the youth, the women, and the different interest groups that make up Zimbabwe. I think the time for allocating blame and what have you and stuff like that surely is over. It's history. We now have to look for solutions and solutions that can work.
Well, Shaka, it looks like we've run out of time. Thank you to all of you for sending in your comments. I look forward to another edition of Shaka Extra Time. Until then, so long from Washington.
Thank you.
So.
Thank you, Ndugu.